Well, hey guys, and welcome back to Bridge the Gap. My name is Jessica Leichtweisz, and I'm the CEO of Hope Education Services. I created the show Bridge the Gap to have open and honest discussions with adults with autism to share a little bit about what we're getting right as a society, what we're doing wrong, and how we can better serve the autism community. Today, I'm super excited to bring my guest on the call. He is, like many of the people I bring on, he is now involved in the world of special education. He grew up having Asperger's syndrome, but was not diagnosed until later in life, which is a theme we'll see a lot with adults because not as much information was known about autism. As we know, the autism numbers rose. A big part of that was people like my guest today who wound up getting diagnosed later in life. Today, he's a special education attorney. He's a board member of COPA, which he'll tell you a little bit more about that. And he is a strong advocate for the autism community. I'm really excited to welcome Michael Gilberg to the show. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Jessica. It's great to be here and to be here with you and to share with families and self-advocates and others about my story, my journey, and how it brought me to be a special ed attorney, hopefully helping families navigate the system for their own children, given the shortcomings I had had in my own education.
And it's so noble for you to have done that. You know, one of the things that I didn't expect from this show was that I would have adults who were watching this who contacted me saying, you know, I really just resonated with your guest on the show. Everything that they said made so much sense to me. And I never knew that I could get a diagnosis of autism later in life. And I've always felt like I was autistic, but, you know, services weren't available. I was born at the wrong time. And I've had people talk about going to get a referral to potentially get a diagnosis from watching this show. And so, you know, that's a really unexpected great outcome that has come from this. When did you get, I know you said later in life you got your diagnosis. When did you get a diagnosis of autism? And what made you seek out that decision to get a diagnosis?
Well, it's funny you say later in life because I don't really think of 18 as later in life, but comparative to today, it's later. Most kids are diagnosed as children. As 18, obviously, I was just an adult, and it wasn't a matter of seeking it out. I'd had difficulty my whole life. I had been in school. I had gone through therapy. Had seen professionals, and just at 18, the psychiatrist, finally realized, wait, this is it. And this was 1995, 96, when autism was kind of just at the cutting edge and people were realizing, as I say, it wasn't just kids sitting in the corner banging their head against the wall who were nonverbal. People realized that people who were both verbal and intelligent and had skills could be on the spectrum. And this is just like at the cutting edge of that point. Like you said, Jessica, it shouldn't matter based on when you were born, whether you get the diagnosis or not. And that's why we're seeing many adults now in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s getting those diagnoses later in life.
Yeah, and when you got that diagnosis, a lot of people talk about feeling like this relief because they finally understand why they've been struggling. And there's this big controversy as to whether or not you should get a diagnosis or whether or not it's just a label. So how do you feel about the fact that you grew up obviously having autism, but not having that diagnosis? When you finally got it, was it like, oh, now I get it? Or was it, oh, I don't really want to be called this. I wasn't called this before, and I don't see why I need to be called this now.
I think, it's funny because I wasn't as old as some people who get it. I was kind of in that middle ground of being a child but not an adult. I was as I always say, I was a stupid 18-year-old. So I didn't want the label. I tried to fight it. I wasn't ready to accept it. And I realized looking back that was foolish. And I think the other problem was at that point I was starting college. I was focused on the future. I said, I don't need this. It doesn't matter anymore. But the more I learn and the more I become aware of, it's still a label to not necessarily excuse behavior, but explain behavior when you're in social situations. Somebody who's blind or deaf wouldn't say, no, I'm not that. And so there's no reason they should do the same with autism. I think the thing is, I was again at a time when it was very transitionary as I'd say, in the world of autism. I think people who get the diagnosis as adults nowadays have a much more access to resources, but in the late 90s, the resources weren't what they are 25 years later. So we're now in a position where it's such a different world that I think I was in what I would call a transitory phase, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, every decade it seems like things are changing. And I was just having a conversation with someone just yesterday talking about I'm writing some copy for my website, which is a new website coming out soon. And I was talking about the DSM-5, and I was reading it and looking at it, and I'm thinking pretty soon there's probably going to be a DSM-6. Now, it was 7 years old. I'm like, okay, within the next couple of years, this is probably going to change again. So it seems like, and it's a good thing, people talk about, everything constantly changing, but I think it's, as a society, as we learn more, we have to adapt to what we're learning. So for you,
And I'll be honest, sorry, in terms of the DSM, I don't know if it's changing or not, because that's more of a psychiatry thing. We use DSM diagnosis in special ed and work with a lot of psychologists, but the DSM itself is ultimately written by psychiatrists.
yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things for you that you talked about is like that you're now working in the field of special education because you felt like you didn't get the support as a child. So a lot of parents today, they're hesitant to get a diagnosis. And I always tell parents, or they're hesitant to take advantage of certain services. So for example, in New Jersey, they call the special needs preschool program a program for handicapped children. And so I've had parents who have rejected those services saying like, no, well, I don't want that label on my child for their whole life. I'm just gonna keep them home. And and I always tell the parents, okay, but years and years and years went into fighting for these services because there was an entire generation who didn't get that support. Now, you've obviously been very successful. Do you think you could, but your journey could have been different if you had got that support? And what would you say to parents today who are in that situation with their children?
Well, I think first of all, there's a stigma to the word handicapped, because I think people hear it and they think of handicapped as the physically disabled, a kid in a wheelchair. And I think part of it is changing perception. And that's why most people prefer the word disabled. Handicapped is kind of a word that's falling out of favor in this day and age. I mean, part of the problem is if you look at the universal symbol of disability, it's a person in a wheelchair. And we're trying to broaden that definition, and not even broaden because it is broad already. And but demonstrate to people that it's not just somebody in a wheelchair. It's a blind person, a deaf person, a person with autism, a person with a learning disability. But those are harder things to visualize generally. I
Yeah,
think,
and you know what? I want to correct myself. They do call it now the preschool child with disability. So I do apologize for that mistake. But they do. You're right. It is being called disability. But even disability tends to be broad because you can't see all disabilities. And like you
exactly.
said, sometimes it's really apparent a kid has autism, and sometimes it's not very apparent. Sometimes it's a silent struggle that you may not see their autism, but that doesn't mean they're not still struggling every day.
Oh, absolutely. And part of the problem is I've had people say to me, "Well, you're not disabled. You look normal. You don't look autistic." And what does looking autistic mean? There's no such thing as looking autistic. And I think the problem is, yes, sometimes it's obvious. I've gone to events and met somebody and be like, "Oh, he's on the spectrum." It's obvious. We can kind of spot it. There's a genetic component. And as I've gotten to be an adult and gotten more sophisticated, I've come to realize a lot of things in my father I see are very clearly autism. He'll still deny it at 72. He doesn't believe he's on the spectrum, but everybody else around him is like, yeah, I see it now. So I think part of it is, you know, you're right, is that you can't always see disability, but disability is there whether you can see it or not. Just like I always tell the story that, there are physical disabilities you can't see. My aunt is missing half of a lung and it impacts her breathing, and she has pain every time she breathes, which is obviously constant. And you can't see it to look at her, but she's severely impaired in her ability to breathe and to function. And the definition of disability is impairs a major life activity. Well, breathing is a major life activity. Autism impacts a major life activity in terms of human interaction, which there's no question is a major life activity. It can interfere with language, communication, learning. All of these things are major components of what it means to be human.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what I love about your story is that, you said, okay, you didn't have certain needs met as a child. And sometimes people get bitter. And rather than, doing something positive, they just get angry and they just will, every day go on social media and just rant and rave about how society failed them. And I fundamentally believe when you find out about a problem, you can do one of three things. Number one is you can complain, which is what most people do, or what a lot of people do. I think what most people do is to do nothing at all. And I think number three is to be the solution to the problem. And that is the premise of why I created this company. It's why I created this show, Bridge the Gap. I found out there was a disconnect between professionals that are working with kids with autism and autistic adults. There was a huge disconnect. Even just me using the word autistic adult, I was always taught to use person first language. I found out that most adults that are autistic, they prefer identity first language. So, you did like I did, and you decided, okay, there's a problem. I'm not going to complain about it. I'm going to solve that problem. So tell us about your decision to work with kids with special needs as an attorney and why that's important to you today.
Well, first, let me also answer the question about the language because I've struggled with that a little bit too. And unlike some people on the spectrum, I don't get caught up. I don't care if you say autistic person or person with autism, but some people do. And I've kind of come to this general thumb of rule is that you would compare it to race or sexual gender or sexual orientation. You wouldn't say a black person. You would say a black person. You wouldn't say a person with blackness. You would say a gay person. You wouldn't say a person with gayness. So you want autism to be the same way, an autistic person, like a black person, a gay person, doesn't work as well with male, female. Whereas something like cancer, which is an illness, you would call it a person with cancer. You wouldn't call them a cancer person. So you want autism to be a part of your identity, like race or gender or sexual orientation, but not be like cancer, which is an illness that needs to be treated or cured. And I think that kind of is a very simple rule of thumb for understanding how you would describe the language.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting perspective. And it's one that's changed. I think the trend 10 years ago was even just the belief that autism was something to be cured. I mean, you used to always see these walks for the cure, and the idea of autism acceptance wasn't really big or wasn't really around. The trend was towards autism recovery. And we talk a lot about that on this show. The fact that when I first started working with kids with autism, it was at the height of the autism recovery movement, the idea that recovery of autism is possible, and that my job as an ABA therapist was to take the autism out of the child. Today, that's not how I look at it. There are still people who look at it that way. My job today, I believe, is to help every child to achieve their fullest potential, whatever that is for them. And I don't want to change who they are in their classes. I understand that they are autistic, they have neurological differences, that that's not, like you said, a disease. It doesn't need a cure. We have to help them learn in a different way because they learn differently. But I still believe that they do have everything that they want and everything they desire. And it's really just up to us to figure out how to teach them differently. But that has been a change, certainly, in the field of autism in the last decade.
Well, absolutely. And like I said, to make the analogy, I think curing autism has been very often analogized to what's gay conversion therapy, the idea of curing someone of being gay, which obviously society now and we all know is not something you should or can cure. Whereas cancer, again, is a disease. There are some people who will say, well, cancer is a form of disability, but ultimately cancer left untreated will kill you. It's not, it doesn't affect who you are and your personality in that sense, but it has to be treated because if it's not, the person will die. Autism, curing autism is, as you said, fundamentally changing who you are. And I always say to people, the issue with ABA is not ABA is bad, as some autistic self-advocates will say. It's what kind of ABA are you doing and what is the behavior? Are you using positive or negative reinforcement, and what are those aversives that you're using if necessary? You and I discussed the Judge Rottenberg Center, which was a place in Massachusetts. People can Google. It's very well known in the community, which has been known for using electric shock therapy on children with autism, depriving them of food, strapping them to a board. That is bad ABA. And again, the behavior question is the behavior something that you find weird or unusual, but it's not harmful to the person or someone else? Or is it something dangerous or harmful? You know, kids who flap or stim, they might be seen as weird by other people or unusual, but they're not harming anyone. If that's who they are, let them be. We all have things we do. I bite my nails, which is a very bad habit. People play with their hair. People tap their foot. These are all forms of stimming. On the other hand, when you have kids who run in the street, that behavior has to be eliminated, because if you don't eliminate that, the kid's going to get hit by a car. You have kids who punch people. That behavior has to be eliminated. I once had a client who was 20 years old and he was intellectually impaired as well as autistic. He tried to go out the second floor window of his family's house Fortunately, he landed on the grass, not the concrete, but that was a behavior that had to be eliminated because it was ultimately dangerous. So the question to me is always, is the behavior dangerous to this child or someone else, or is it invasive of their personal space, or is it just something you find unusual? And to me, that's where the question comes in. If it's dangerous to themselves or others, or invasive to the personal space, inappropriate touching, that has to be addressed. If the behavior is just something unusual, who cares? It's not affecting you. If the kid wants to flap his hands, let him flap his hands.
Yeah, and I actually do agree with you, and I've written articles about that. And I've changed. And when I first started, again, working with kids, I did tell kids you couldn't clap your hands. And I shared a story before on this show, so you might, if you're watching this show every week, you might have heard this story before. But I was doing my student teaching back in 2008, and I was working with a child, and I call him Jack. That wasn't his name, but I call him Jack. And he was flapping his hands, and I told him to stop flapping his hands and put his hands down. I would tell him quiet hand, which is what I was taught by the actual teacher in the classroom at that time, who was doing the best they could with the information they had. And Jack had said to me, he's like, well, why do I have to keep my hands quiet? And I just told him, like, well, it doesn't look right. So if you want to fit in with your friends, you have to keep your hands down so you look like everybody else. And he told me, I don't want to look like everybody else. I want my hands to be free. Why do you want to put my hands in jail? And he was about 10 years old at the time. And I never forgot that. Although I will admit, for the first 8 years I worked with kids, or even 10 years, I didn't change my ideology. I continued to tell kids that they couldn't flap their hands and that they had to try to fit in. And it wasn't until recently I was open to the idea of, well, maybe I'm wrong. And that's why I created this show, because there's a lot of really well-intended people. And it's not that they're doing horrible things to kids. I mean, I would never, ever have, in my wildest dreams, even, someone told me when I first started, hey, you should electrocute a child, electric shock therapy. I mean, that would be totally just obviously wrong to me. But I was making these little mistakes, and kids were being hurt, and kids were being changed, and I was having a negative effect on their self-esteem when I was really well-intended. And that's what this show is about. It's about professionals coming together and learning from what we've done right and what mistakes we've made, so that way we don't repeat them and we can change. And I think it takes a degree of courage to say, hey, I was wrong. For 10 years, I did the wrong thing. But if we don't talk about that, nothing is ever going to change.
Well, and Jessica, I think you're right. And I think part of human growth as a general rule is the ability to admit, hey, I made a mistake and change. We all make mistakes. We're human. Part of the human experience is making mistakes. We've all made mistakes in our life. None of us are perfect. And, growth is about admitting change, admitting mistakes. And I think that, like you said, we're in a society where people want to be who they are. Again, as long as you're not harming someone, be who individual. Like I said, people have stims all the time, biting your nails, tapping your feet, playing with your hair, chewing your hair. People do all sorts of things that, that are considered, quote, stims. Again, as long as it's not harmful to someone else or to yourself, I think it's fine. Like I said, on the other hand, though, if you're going around hitting someone or touching other people, then you're invading their personal space, and we all have that right to bodily autonomy. Your right to individualism doesn't eliminate someone else's right to bodily autonomy.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're at the point where we have to start wrapping this show up, but I do want to talk about, before we close, what you're doing today in the special education world and why that's important to you.
Sure. So as I said, and you mentioned briefly, I grew up with undiagnosed Asperger's. To make a long story short, I had a friend when I was in 6th grade, and it's in my story on my website, who the school said was fine to go back to public school while they kept me in special ed. I'm not going to go into all the specifics. People can read about it, but they did the wrong thing by both of us, and he ended up committing suicide the day before his 16th birthday. So I say they failed me, but they failed him worse. I never got an appropriate education until I got to college, and I caught myself up, and I had to fill in those gaps on my own. Unfortunately, not everybody is going to be as motivated or as willing to do it as I am, but I caught myself up, graduated college with honors, graduated law school, a little harder than college, And now I represent families in special education who feel that the school district is not giving them the appropriate services under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. When families feel they either need more services, a different program, possibly a private placement. Very often what attorneys like myself do is we represent families to try to get a private out-of-district school when the school district wants to educate them in district because it's less money, and the district can't educate this child. They can't meet his or her individual needs. So what I'm doing today is a lot of representing families who are trying to get private placements because they've tried the school district and they feel after, as one of my clients calls it, multiple cycles of failure, that they're not going to get anywhere unless they have a private placement where they can start experiencing success both academically and socially and emotionally.
Yeah, and it's really important work that you're doing. And I have seen a positive trend, which maybe is not positive for your business, but positive trends towards schools doing the right thing. Certainly more today than they did 10, 12 years ago. But it's still very important to have people like yourself
Well,
who
I
are
think,
really strong advocates.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's
I
okay.
think that, you always have to be on guard. And I always tell parents, don't take everything the school district says on face value. There's always a motivation by the school district to save money, which is not, and I'm not criticizing administrators who get told by their school boards or their superintendents, you have to cut the budget. But ultimately, the school districts tell the parents what they think the child needs based on their own individual needs. Always be skeptical. Always hire an advocate or an attorney who can say, no, you're wrong. This is what the child needs. Don't take everything on face value. I think a lot of the problem is parents take everything on face value. They assume, well, the school district told me, and I've had a lot of people say this to me, so I assumed it was correct, and they don't get told that they can have outside evaluations at school district expense. And I always tell parents, I think you're always better off with an independent evaluation than a school district evaluation, because the school district has a motivation in how they do that evaluation. Whereas if you can get a truly independent third-party evaluation, that's better.
Yeah, and now I can't tell you how many times I've seen like a parent be in an ABA program for early intervention, for example, and then the school paid for a developmental pediatrician and they did not get a diagnosis, but they did when they went to a different pediatrician that the family paid for, the private insurance paid for. So unfortunately, that politics does still exist, and which is why it's so important that people can find people like you as a resource. So I want to end on a negative note, but we do have to wrap up the show. I promised this plays in several public access television shows, and I promise them we'll keep them right under 30 minutes. So do you have any final advice and just how to access your website if people wanted to contact you?
Sure, and I would always say to people, contact me if you're in New York or Connecticut. I'm an attorney in both of those states. You can access my website at michaelgilbergesq.com. Again, that's michaelgilbergesq.com. And my email is michaelgilbergesq@gmail.com. And another resource, as you mentioned before, is COPA, which is COPAA.org, which is the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. I'm on the national board, and that is the professional organization of attorneys and advocates who represent families in special education. And basically anything you need is on the COPA website. There's going to be a lot of resources there. And if you need to find an attorney or advocate, that's where you go to find them in any state.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your time with us and your story. I really appreciate you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I appreciate it.
So this has been another episode of Bridge the Gap. If you tune in every week, thank you for your support. This show airs at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on my YouTube channel, which is getautismanswers.com. It also plays at several times on different public access television shows. If you're watching this on TV, welcome. Thank you for watching us. If you want to check out the rest of the episodes, you can head over to getautismanswers.com. That's where all the replays are. I look forward to seeing everyone again next week, and thanks again, Michael, for being on the show.
Thank you.